The rain had been falling since dawn, turning the clay roads into a slick mess that clung to boots and wagon wheels alike. Jacob Miller pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders as he stepped down from his battered pickup. The sound of water dripping from the brim of his hat. The auction yard smelled of damp hay and wet animals, a heavy scent that mixed with the metallic tang of rust from the old gates. He hadn't planned to be here. Truth be told, he didn't even have the extra money to waste. But something about the quiet hours of the morning had pushed him out of his house and into the chaos of this place. Men with worn faces and calloused hands leaned on the wooden rails, calling out to one another over the clamor of the auctioneer's rapid-fire chant. Cows lowed in protest, goats bleated from a pen nearby, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance. Jacob moved through the crowd, nodding at familiar faces but avoiding conversation. He didn't have much to say these days. The farm had been running on the barest thread of hope. His savings were gone, and the loneliness of the empty farmhouse seemed to grow heavier with every passing week. A heavy thud echoed through the barn as the next lot was led into the ring. Jacob turned his head just in time to see a horse stumble in, its hooves slipping on the wet planks. The crowd's laughter rose like a cruel tide. This was no proud, spirited animal. This was a shadow of one. Its ribs pressed sharply against dull, mud-matted skin, the mane tangled into knots, one cloudy eye staring out in a milky haze. The other eye, dark and piercing, swept the room, not in fear but in a way that made Jacob pause. The auctioneer cracked his joke, and a few men chuckled. Here's a fine example of a retirement case, folks. Who's ready to give this one a last warm bed? The laughter that followed wasn't warm at all. The bidding started low, absurdly low, and still no one moved. The horse stood still, its head held high despite its condition, water dripping from the tips of its ears. Jacob realized he was staring, unable to break the gaze of that single, unclouded eye. There was something in it, something that didn't belong in a half-starved animal. Not just stubbornness, awareness. He told himself to turn away. He didn't need another mouth to feed, certainly not one that would bring no return. But when the auctioneer barked, going once, going twice, Jacob's hand went up before he knew it. A couple of heads turned in mild surprise. The gavel came down with a dull thud, and the horse was his. The laughter followed him as he signed the paperwork, though no one said anything to his face. Out in the yard, he backed his rusty trailer up to the loading chute. The horse stepped inside without a fight, moving slowly but with a kind of measured precision, as though it understood exactly where it was going and why. Jacob latched the gate and climbed into the truck, glancing into the rearview mirror as he pulled out. That eye was still watching, sharp and unblinking. The road home wound through low hills and past skeletal winter trees. Rain sheeted against the windshield, and the wipers squeaked in their tired rhythm. Jacob found himself glancing back more than once. The horse's breathing was heavy but steady. More curious was the way it turned its head at certain moments, ears flicking toward fields or distant barns, scanning the horizon like a soldier surveying a battlefield. By the time they reached the farm, the light had faded to a deep gray. The old barn leaned slightly to one side, but it was dry and warm enough inside. Jacob led the horse in, speaking in a low voice, unsure why he was bothering. "Well, here you are," he said, fastening the stall door. "Don't make me regret this." The horse stood still, watching him. The cloudy eye gave it a weary, vulnerable look, but the other, black and glassy, seemed to study him in return. Jacob fetched hay from aloft, noting again the scar on its flank. It was a peculiar shape, not the neat oval of a standard brand, but something jagged, like a letter or a mark burned in haste. He traced it lightly with his fingers before stepping back. The horse flinched, not from pain, but as if reacting to the memory of something. He fed it grain, topped up the water bucket, and turned to leave. Outside, the rain was a steady whisper on the roof. The farmhouse lights glowed faintly across the yard, a lonely beacon in the gloom. He told himself it was just another mouth to feed, and he'd figure it out later. Yet something about the animal gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Hours later, well past midnight, Jacob awoke to a faint, rhythmic sound. At first he thought it was the wind tapping loose boards, but the pattern was too deliberate. Pulling on his coat, he crossed the yard, the lantern swinging in his hand. The barn smelled of hay and damp leather, the air warmer than outside. The sound came again, soft thuds, measured and steady. He rounded the corner of the stall and froze. The horse was moving in slow, deliberate circles, hooves placing with careful precision, despite the cramped space. Every few steps it would stop, shift weight, and start again, the motion oddly graceful for such a worn body. Jacob's brow furrowed. This wasn't restless pacing. It was practiced, like the animal was running through a drill it knew by heart. The moment the lantern light spilled fully into the stall, the horse halted and turned to face him. Its ears pricked forward, and for a heartbeat, the two simply stared at each other. Jacob's grip on the lantern tightened. "What on earth happened to you?" he murmured, the question hanging in the cool air. The horse blinked slowly, as though the answer was there but locked away, waiting for the right moment to surface. Jacob stood there longer than he meant to, listening to the steady breathing, feeling the pull of a story he couldn't yet name. The rain outside drummed on the roof, and somewhere far away, a low roll of thunder carried over the hills. Finally, he stepped back, closing the stall door with a soft click. As he crossed the yard toward the house, he glanced over his shoulder. Through the narrow gap in the barn boards, that unclouded eye was still there, watching him with a patience that felt almost human. And though Jacob didn't know why, he felt certain this was only the beginning. Morning broke with a pale light that bled slowly into the gray sky, the rain finally having eased during the night. Jacob stepped into the barn with a steaming mug in one hand, expecting to find the horse standing exactly where he had left it. Instead, Shadow, though he hadn't yet spoken the name aloud, was already alert, ears flicking toward him as if anticipating his arrival. The straw around its hooves was undisturbed, save for a small cleared patch where it had slept. Jacob set the mug on a ledge and moved closer, noting that the animal's coat, though still rough, had a faint sheen where he'd brushed it the day before. He reached for the halter, half expecting resistance, but the horse stepped forward without hesitation, lowering its head in compliance. That struck Jacob as odd. Most horses he'd worked with needed coaxing, especially those unfamiliar with a new owner. This one moved like it had been trained to obey without question, the kind of calm, drilled obedience he hadn't seen since he was a boy helping his uncle break in cavalry stock. Outside, the ground was soft but no longer a swamp. He led the horse into the yard, testing how it might follow. A tug on the rope to the left, a light pull to the right. The animal responded instantly, aligning its steps with his own. "Well," Jacob muttered, "you're full of surprises." He guided it toward the pasture, but instead of charging ahead into open space, the horse waited for his cue. When released, it didn't bolt or toss its head in wild freedom. It trotted a measured loop, then returned to stand near him, almost as if reporting back. The efficiency unsettled him. Most neglected animals came with mistrust, but this one seemed to be reading his movements, waiting for instructions. He tried a few commands he remembered from long ago, short, clipped words his uncle had used. To his astonishment, the horse obeyed the unfamiliar syllables, pivoting neatly or halting mid-step. That night's image of its deliberate pacing returned to his mind. In the days that followed, Jacob settled into a routine. Each morning he fed and brushed the horse, checking for sores or signs of illness. The scar on its flank drew his attention often. In better light, he could see the edges of it weren't random. There was a shape buried in the burned skin, almost like a symbol. He didn't recognize it, but it stirred something faintly familiar, like a tune half remembered from childhood. The work around the farm was relentless, and having the horse meant more chores, mucking stalls, hauling hay, mending the paddock fence. Yet Jacob found himself lingering in the barn longer than necessary. Shadow, he finally used the name aloud on the third day, had a way of watching him work, calm but alert, as though every hammer strike or shovel scrape mattered. On evenings when the wind howled across the hills, Jacob would stay in the barn after feeding time, leaning against the stall door, speaking in low tones about debts, about his late wife, about how the farm felt more like a sinking ship each season. One night, after a particularly heavy day repairing a collapsed section of fencing, Jacob slumped onto a bale of hay, shoulders aching. The words slipped out without planning. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, the only sound was the creak of the barn roof in the wind. Then Shadow stepped forward and lowered its head until the weight of it rested against Jacob's shoulder. The warmth startled him, the deliberate stillness even more so. He let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. From that evening onward, the bond between them felt less like owner and animal, and more like allies. Jacob tested the horse's abilities further. He set up small tasks, moving around barrels, navigating tight turns between fence posts. Each time, Shadow performed with uncanny precision, rarely making a mistake. More than skill, there was intent in the way it moved, as though it understood these drills were not just exercises, but a language between them. Curiosity grew. Jacob asked around town, stopping in at the feed store and the diner, sketching the scar on napkins to see if anyone recognized it. He got only puzzled looks or shrugs. Some suggested it might be an old ranch brand, but no one could say for sure. Late one afternoon, while stacking feed sacks in the loft, Jacob caught sight of Shadow in the paddock below. The horse was standing at the far fence, head lifted toward the north fields. Its ears swiveled sharply at some distant sound Jacob couldn't hear. The intensity of its focus was uncanny, as if it were listening for a specific signal. When Jacob called out, the horse turned immediately, but that momentary stillness left a shiver in his spine. By the end of the week, the strangeness of Shadow's presence had settled into a rhythm, comforting yet threaded with questions. Jacob had stopped thinking of the purchase as a foolish whim. Something was different about this animal, and it wasn't just training. There was history in its eyes, something that belonged to another life entirely. One evening, a storm moved in fast, the sky bruising purple before the sun had fully set. The wind carried a low rumble of thunder, and Jacob moved to close the barn doors. Shadow was already inside, standing still but restless, shifting weight from one hoof to the other. A sudden crack of lightning split the horizon, and in that flash of light, Jacob caught the horse's posture, neck arched, ears forward, body angled like it was ready to launch into action. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Jacob stood watching, the doors half closed behind him. He didn't understand it yet, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever past Shadow had lived, it wasn't a simple one. And the longer the horse stayed on his farm, the more certain he became that its story was far from over. The following morning, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth from the storm that had passed in the night. Jacob was out by the fence line, hammering in a new post, when a sudden movement in the pasture caught his attention. Shadow, who had been grazing lazily, lifted his head and then bolted, not in panic, but in a swift, calculated burst. The horse cut across the field in a sharp arc, weaving between scattered barrels Jacob had left near the shed. The movements were deliberate, almost choreographed, each turn precise, each stride measured. Jacob leaned on the hammer, watching in disbelief. This wasn't the random energy of a restless animal. It was training, polished, disciplined training. He found himself drawn to the memory of his uncle's cavalry drills from decades ago, where horses were taught to maneuver through chaos, carrying riders safely through danger. Shadow moved in that same way, executing patterns Jacob hadn't seen in years. When the horse finally slowed, Jacob stepped into the field, curiosity gnawing at him. "Where'd you learn that?" he murmured as Shadow approached, breath steaming in the cool air. The question was absurd, yet it hung between them, unanswered but heavy. He reached out, running a hand over the scar on Shadow's flank again. This time, his fingers caught on faint, raised edges he hadn't noticed before. Leaning closer, he saw that the scar wasn't just a single mark. It was part of a larger, half-faded brand, a symbol with what looked like the remnants of 2 letters etched into the skin. That evening, Jacob went to the small storage shed behind the barn to retrieve an old saddle he hadn't used in years. On impulse, he brought it into the stall. Shadow didn't flinch as Jacob lifted it onto his back. Instead, he shifted to make the process easier, almost like he had been waiting for this moment. When Jacob swung into the saddle, the horse stood still until given the signal to move. Then, with no urging, Shadow broke into a smooth trot, responding instantly to the slightest pressure of the reins. They moved together through the pasture, Jacob barely having to guide him. The horse seemed to anticipate each turn, adjusting speed before Jacob could ask. When they stopped, Jacob's heart was pounding, not from exertion, but from the thrill of discovery. Whoever had trained Shadow had done so with extraordinary skill. A few days later, while Jacob was unloading supplies from the truck, a sleek black SUV rolled up the dirt road and stopped in front of his gate. A man in his late 40s stepped out, his coat too fine for farm work, his shoes already caked with mud from the short walk. "Afternoon," he called with a practiced smile. "Name's Harris. I was passing through and couldn't help noticing your horse." Jacob kept his expression neutral. "He's not for sale." Harris chuckled. "Everything's for sale at the right price. That's not just any old nag you've got there. Looks like he's got some history." His eyes lingered on the scar, his smile tightening. "I could make you a generous offer. More than that horse's weight in gold, I promise." The air between them cooled. "I said he's not for sale," Jacob replied, his voice even but firm. Harris's gaze sharpened, though his smile never faltered. "Well, if you change your mind," he handed Jacob a business card, the paper thick and expensive, and returned to his vehicle. The SUV's tires sprayed gravel as it sped away. That night, Jacob found fresh tire tracks in the soft dirt near the barn, tracks that hadn't been there before sunset. A prickle of unease worked its way up his spine. He checked the barn door. It was still latched, Shadow inside and unharmed, but the horse was restless, shifting from hoof to hoof, ears twitching toward every sound. Unable to shake the feeling, Jacob took the card from his pocket and turned it over in his hands. There was no business name, just a phone number and the name Harris in bold print. He tossed it onto the kitchen table, but couldn't stop glancing at it as the hours passed. The next morning, determined to learn more, Jacob drove into town. At the library, he searched through old local archives, hoping the brand might match a ranch registry. No luck. On a hunch, he widened the search to regional news from a decade ago. That's when he found it, a grainy photograph in an old article about a flood rescue. In the picture, a dark horse stood chest-deep in water, a young girl clinging to its neck. The brand on its flank matched Shadow's exactly. The article detailed how the horse had carried multiple people to safety during a disaster, guided by its rider through treacherous waters. It had belonged to a specialized rescue unit, a rare program where horses were trained for life-saving missions. The piece ended abruptly, noting that the horse had gone missing during the aftermath and was presumed dead. Jacob leaned back in the chair, the words blurring for a moment. Shadow wasn't just trained. He was a survivor, a hero. And now, someone who knew that history wanted him back. Back at the farm, Jacob stood by the stall, the knowledge heavy in his chest. He ran a hand along Shadow's neck. "You've seen more than I ever will, haven't you?" The horse exhaled slowly, as if answering. That night, just past midnight, Jacob was jolted awake by a faint noise, a muffled clink of metal, like a latch being tested. He grabbed the old rifle from beside the bed and moved quietly toward the barn. The moonlight was thin, but enough to catch a shadow slipping along the fence line. Shadow stood rigid in the stall, ears locked forward, gaze fixed on the dark figure. Jacob called out sharply, and the intruder froze. For a heartbeat, silence hung in the cold air. Then the figure turned and disappeared into the tree line. Jacob stepped into the barn, his pulse hammering. Shadow relaxed slightly when he approached, but his body remained tense, muscles taut under the skin. Jacob closed the stall door with care, bolting it twice before leaning against it. He didn't know what Harris's true intentions were, but he was certain now they weren't harmless. Whoever wanted Shadow wasn't going to give up easily. As the wind moved through the pines beyond the pasture, Jacob's mind worked quickly. He had stumbled onto a story much bigger than a chance purchase at an auction. And if he wanted to keep the horse safe, he'd need to be ready for whatever came next. The next day dawned cold and brittle, the kind of morning where the frost clung stubbornly to the grass even after the sun broke the horizon. Jacob didn't sleep much. Every creak of the old farmhouse had kept him on edge. He was still thinking about the figure at the barn when the sound of tires crunching over gravel reached his ears. Through the thin lace curtain, he saw the black SUV return. Harris stepped out again, this time without the forced smile. His hands were buried in the pockets of his tailored coat, his gaze fixed on the barn. "I'm done being polite, Miller," he called, his voice carrying easily over the crisp air. "That horse belongs to me." Jacob walked out to meet him, keeping his posture calm though his jaw was set. "The way I see it, you lost any claim the day you let him end up at auction half-starved." Harris's expression tightened. "You have no idea what you're meddling in. That horse is worth more than you can imagine, not for money, but for what he can do." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "He's trained in ways you wouldn't believe, and there are people willing to pay a fortune to get him back." "I don't care who's paying," Jacob said, his tone iron. "He's staying here." For a moment, they stood in the cold, locked in silent defiance. Then Harris's smile returned, thin and unpleasant. "You'll regret that." Without another word, he got back into the SUV and drove off, the engine's growl lingering long after he was gone. Jacob spent the rest of the morning tightening the locks on the barn and checking the fence lines. The unease in his gut had turned into certainty. Harris wasn't bluffing. Whoever he worked for wanted Shadow, and they'd come for him again. That afternoon, Jacob called an old acquaintance, a retired cavalry officer named Whitmore who lived in a neighboring county. Whitmore had trained rescue and military horses for decades, and if anyone could shed light on Shadow's past, it would be him. Jacob described the brand and the horse's abilities. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Whitmore said quietly, "You're not talking about just any rescue horse. That brand marks him as part of Unit Echo, a covert division trained for high-risk operations. Those horses were capable of navigating disaster zones, finding survivors, even responding to advanced command sequences. They were rare, and after the program was shut down, most were sold off or disappeared." "Disappeared?" Jacob asked. "Some were stolen, sold to the highest bidder. If someone's looking for him now, they don't want to give him a retirement. They want to use him." The words hardened Jacob's resolve. He hung up knowing that keeping Shadow wasn't just about sentiment anymore. It was about protection. 2 nights later, the attempt came. Jacob woke to the sound of the barn doors creaking open, far too slow and careful to be the wind. He slipped into his boots, grabbed the rifle, and stepped into the moonlit yard. The cold air stung his lungs as he approached the barn, every sense sharpened. Inside, a flashlight beam swept across the stalls, settling on Shadow, who stood rigid, ears pinned back. Harris was there, flanked by another man, broad-shouldered, his face hidden by a cap. "I told you not to make this hard," Harris said without turning around. "You should have listened when I said no," Jacob replied, voice steady. The bigger man moved toward Shadow, but the horse suddenly sprang into motion. In a blur of controlled power, he pivoted, sidestepped, and used his weight to shove the intruder back into the stall rail. The man cursed, stumbling. Harris barked an order, sharp, unfamiliar syllables, but instead of obeying, Shadow wheeled around to stand between Jacob and the intruders, head lowered like a shield. Jacob stepped forward, rifle raised. "Out. Now." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Harris lifted his hands, backing toward the door, his eyes locked on the horse with something between frustration and awe. "You have no idea what you're wasting here," he muttered before disappearing into the night. Jacob bolted the barn doors and stayed there until dawn, sitting on an overturned bucket, while Shadow stood nearby, calm now but watchful. The bond between them had shifted again. What had begun as a silent truce had become something forged in shared defiance. In the days that followed, word spread quietly through the community about the break-in. A few neighbors came by to check on Jacob, offering to help mend the fence or keep an eye on the road. Harris didn't return, at least not openly, but Jacob knew the danger wasn't gone. Still, he felt a quiet triumph in knowing they had stood their ground together. Spring crept in slowly, turning the fields from brittle brown to soft green. The farm was still fragile, but there was a new rhythm to the days. Jacob began working with Shadow in earnest, not just to keep him fit, but to let him do what he was built for. They practiced drills in the pasture, weaving through obstacles, responding to subtle cues. With each session, the horse's movements grew sharper, more fluid, as though shedding years of neglect. One morning, Jacob stood at the fence watching Shadow gallop across the field, his coat now rich and sleek in the sunlight. He realized he wasn't just looking at a horse. He was looking at a partner, one who had carried the weight of a past life, and somehow found his way here. The memory of Harris's words still lingered, but Jacob pushed them aside. Shadow's place was here, not in the hands of those who saw him as a tool. And Jacob's own life, once a quiet descent into solitude, had shifted because of this animal who refused to be broken by his history. On a warm afternoon, with the sky streaked in gold and lavender, Jacob saddled Shadow and rode out beyond the pastures. The wind carried the scent of blooming wildflowers, and the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth felt like the heartbeat of something new. As they reached the crest of a hill, Jacob slowed the pace, looking out over the land. "We made it, didn't we?" he murmured, patting the strong neck beneath him. Shadow's ears flicked back in acknowledgement, and for a moment, it felt like the horse understood every word. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the fields. Jacob knew the challenges weren't over. Harris might return, or others might come. But for now, they had won a small victory, and that was enough. As they turned toward home, the farmhouse windows glowed softly in the distance, and Jacob felt a rare sense of peace settle in his chest. Some rescues happen in a single dramatic moment, he thought. Others happen slowly, quietly, over time. In this case, it was both. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.